The pilot grabbed Sergeant Thomas Riley's wrist and whispered, "Don't let them take the case." Then he coughed blood onto the metal floor of the shattered cockpit and said something that made Riley's stomach drop. "They shot us down. Our own people." Riley stared at the steel case chained to the man's belt, at the documents spilling from the torn leather satchel, at the stamped words he could barely read in the dim light filtering through the canopy. Classified. Eyes only. He looked back at his squad, 8 men standing in the mud outside the wreckage, and knew that whatever happened next would change everything. The pilot's hand went limp. Riley felt the weight of the case in his palm, heard the distant rumble of trucks approaching through the swamp, and understood that the enemy wasn't always the one you'd been trained to fight. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The heat hit them first. Louisiana in July was a furnace wrapped in wet cloth, the kind of heat that made your uniform stick to your back before you'd even started moving. Sergeant Thomas Riley wiped sweat from his forehead and squinted through the trees, watching his men spread out in a loose line across the training ground. They'd been at Camp Claiborne for 3 weeks now, running drills in the swamps while the rest of the army prepared for Europe. Nobody told them why they were here instead of overseas. Nobody had to. Riley was 32, older than most of the boys in his squad. He'd grown up in Birmingham, left home at 17, and spent the better part of a decade working steel mills before the draft found him. The army had given him 3 stripes and a squad of men who looked to him for answers he didn't always have. But he knew how to keep them alive, and that was enough. "Corporal Bennett," Riley called out, his voice cutting through the thick air. "Tighten that formation. This ain't Sunday school." Corporal David Bennett, a wiry kid from Detroit with quick hands and a quicker mouth, adjusted his rifle and fell back into line. "Yes, Sergeant. Thought we were just walking today." "You thought wrong." The exercise was simple. Navigate 3 miles through the swamp, locate the mock enemy position, and return before nightfall. Standard infantry training, the kind they'd done 100 times. But Riley had learned long ago that simple didn't mean easy, and routine didn't mean safe. The swamp was unpredictable. Snakes, gators, sinkholes that could swallow a man whole if he stepped wrong. And the heat. Always the heat. They moved in silence, boots squelching through mud and shallow water. Mosquitoes swarmed around them in clouds. Private Leon Hayes, the youngest of the squad at 19, slapped at his neck and muttered something under his breath. Next to him, Private Eugene Foster, built like a boxer with hands that could bend steel, kept his eyes forward and said nothing. Foster never said much. He didn't have to. The way he carried himself, steady and unshakable, told you everything you needed to know. Riley checked his compass, adjusted their heading, and kept walking. The trees pressed in close, cypress and tupelo tangled with vines thick as rope. Somewhere in the distance, a heron called out, its cry sharp and lonely. The sound echoed across the water and faded into nothing. Then they heard it. A low rumble, distant at first, like thunder rolling across the sky. But the sky was clear, pale blue stretched tight over the canopy. Riley stopped, held up a fist. The squad froze behind him. "You hear that, Sergeant?" Bennett asked, his voice low. Riley nodded. The rumble grew louder, deeper. The unmistakable roar of aircraft engines pushed past their limits. He tilted his head, trying to pinpoint the direction. Northwest, maybe a mile out. The sound climbed higher, straining, then suddenly cut into a high-pitched whine that made his teeth ache. "That's a plane," Hayes said, his eyes wide. "Something's wrong with it." The whine turned into a scream, metal tearing, engines dying, then the impact. The ground shook. Birds exploded from the trees in a black wave, their wings beating the air in panic. A column of smoke rose above the canopy, thick and dark, curling upward like a fist. Riley didn't hesitate. "Move, double time." They ran. Mud sucked at their boots, branches whipped across their faces, but they kept moving. Riley's heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline burning through the fatigue. Behind him, he could hear Bennett's breathing, sharp and fast, and the heavier footfalls of Foster crashing through the underbrush. The smoke grew thicker as they closed in. The smell hit them next, acrid and chemical, mixed with burning fuel and something else. Something worse. Riley slowed as they broke through the tree line into a clearing, and then he saw it. The plane. It was a B-17, or what was left of one. The bomber had come down hard, nose first into the soft earth, the fuselage twisted and torn like paper. One wing had sheared off completely, lying 50 yards away in a tangle of metal and fabric. The tail section jutted up at an angle, the rudder still intact, the white star and bar markings scorched but visible. Smoke poured from the cockpit thick and black, and small fires licked at the torn aluminum skin. "Jesus Christ," Bennett whispered. Riley moved forward slowly, his rifle up, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The cockpit was crushed inward, the glass shattered, but he could see movement inside. Someone was alive. "Foster, Hayes, secure the perimeter," Riley ordered. "Bennett, with me." They approached carefully, stepping over twisted metal and broken equipment. The heat from the fires was intense, pushing against them like a physical force. Riley reached the cockpit and peered inside. The pilot was pinned against the controls, his flight suit torn and soaked with blood. His face was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. But his eyes were open, and they locked onto Riley with desperate intensity. "Help me," the pilot rasped. "Get me out." Riley and Bennett climbed into the wreckage, their boots crunching on broken glass. The pilot's legs were trapped under the collapsed instrument panel, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. But what caught Riley's attention was the steel case chained to the man's belt, about the size of a briefcase, locked with a combination dial. Next to it, a torn leather satchel spilled papers across the cockpit floor. "We got you," Riley said, gripping the pilot's shoulders. "Bennett, help me lift this panel." They strained against the weight, metal groaning as they pushed. The pilot screamed, a raw sound that cut through the noise of the fires. But the panel shifted and Riley pulled the man free, dragging him out of the cockpit and into the clearing. The pilot collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. Blood seeped through his flight suit in half a dozen places. Riley knelt beside him, checking for wounds. Bennett stood over them, his rifle scanning the tree line. "What happened?" Riley asked, his voice steady. "What brought you down?" The pilot's hand shot out and grabbed Riley's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes were wide, fevered, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Don't let them take the case." Riley stared at him. "What case? What are you talking about?" The pilot's other hand fumbled at the chain on his belt, his fingers shaking. "This. They can't have it. They shot us down. Our own people." The words hung in the air like smoke. Riley felt something cold slide down his spine. He looked at the steel case, at the scattered papers, at the stamped words he could now read clearly. "Classified. Eyes only. Operation Sentinel." "Who shot you down?" Riley demanded. "Who?" The pilot coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. "The orders came from Washington. We were supposed to deliver this to the base, but someone didn't want it to arrive. They scrambled fighters, told us it was an exercise." He laughed, a wet, broken sound. "We believed them, right up until they opened fire." Riley's mind raced. He looked back at the wreckage, at the torn metal, and the fires still burning. Then he heard it. The distant rumble of engines. Not aircraft this time. Trucks. "Sergeant," Foster called out from the tree line. "We got company. Military vehicles coming fast." Riley looked down at the pilot. The man's breathing was growing weaker, his eyes starting to glaze. But his grip on Riley's wrist tightened one last time. "Don't trust them," the pilot whispered. "Don't trust anyone, promise me." Riley hesitated. Then he nodded. "I promise." The pilot's hand went limp. His eyes stared up at the sky, unseeing. Riley stood slowly, the weight of the steel case heavy in his hands. He looked at Bennett, at Foster emerging from the trees, at Hayes standing guard with his rifle. The sound of the trucks grew louder. Riley made a decision. He grabbed the leather satchel from the wreckage, stuffed the scattered papers inside, and slung it over his shoulder. The steel case he kept in his hands, feeling the weight of whatever secret was locked inside. "We move," he said quietly. "Now, Sergeant?" Bennett's voice was uncertain. "What about the body? What about reporting this?" Riley looked at the dead pilot, at the burning wreckage, at the smoke still rising into the clear blue sky. He thought about the words. "They shot us down. Our own people." "We report it," Riley said, "but not yet. First, we find out what's in this case. The trucks burst through the tree line as Riley and his squad melted back into the swamp. Behind them, voices shouted orders, boots hit the ground, and the clearing filled with soldiers. But by then Riley and his men were gone, swallowed by the heat and the trees and the dark water, and the secret they carried with them began to burn hotter than any Louisiana sun. They moved through the swamp like ghosts. Single file, Riley at the front with the steel case tucked under one arm and his rifle in the other. The leather satchel bounced against his hip with every step. Behind him, Bennett kept glancing back over his shoulder, his jaw tight. Foster brought up the rear, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew how to disappear. The sound of trucks faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic splash of boots in shallow water and the buzz of insects. The heat pressed down like a weight. Riley's uniform was soaked through, clinging to his skin, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Not yet. After 20 minutes, he raised his fist. The squad stopped, spreading out in defensive positions without being told. Riley listened. The swamp was never truly silent. There was always something moving, something breathing, something alive in the murky water and tangled roots. But beneath the natural sounds, he heard nothing mechanical. No engines. No voices calling out search patterns. For now they were clear. Riley turned to his men. Hayes was breathing hard, his young face flushed with heat and adrenaline. Foster looked calm, almost bored, his rifle resting easy in his hands. Bennett was staring at the steel case. "Sergeant," Bennett said quietly, "what the hell did we just do?" Riley set the case down on a fallen log and wiped sweat from his eyes. His mind was still processing what the pilot had said. Shot down by their own people. Orders from Washington. The words didn't make sense, but the desperation in the dying man's voice had been real. The fear had been real. "We secured evidence from a crash site," Riley said evenly. "That's all." "That's all?" Bennett's voice rose slightly. "We just ran from our own army. We took classified material. If they catch us, we explain," Riley interrupted. "But first, we figure out what we're carrying." He knelt beside the case, examining the lock. It was military grade, combination dial, 3 numbers. No way to force it without destroying whatever was inside. Riley pulled the leather satchel off his shoulder and opened it. Papers spilled out, some typed, some handwritten, all stamped with red ink. Classified. Top secret. Eyes only. Foster moved closer, peering over Riley's shoulder. "What's it say?" Riley picked up one of the typed documents, holding it up to catch the filtered light through the canopy. His eyes scanned the text, and with each line his stomach tightened. Subject: Operation Sentinel, Phase 2. Classification: Top secret distribution. General staff only. The document detailed a weapons test, something called Compound X7, developed at a facility in New Mexico. The language was technical, full of terms Riley didn't fully understand, but the implications were clear enough. They were testing something new, something powerful. And according to the memo, the test subjects were soldiers, American soldiers. "Jesus," Riley muttered. "What?" Bennett leaned in. "What does it say?" Riley handed him the document and picked up another one. This one was a personnel roster, names and ranks, along with dates and locations. Camp Claiborne was on the list. So were a dozen other bases across the South. Next to each location was a number, test group designations. Hayes spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Sergeant, are we in trouble?" Riley looked at the young private. Hayes was scared, and he had every right to be. They all did. But Riley had made a promise to a dying man, and something in his gut told him that whatever was in these papers, whatever was locked in that steel case, it was worth the risk. "We might be," Riley said honestly. "But if what I'm reading is true, someone's running experiments on soldiers without their knowledge, and that pilot knew about it. That's why they shot him down." Foster's expression didn't change, but his voice carried an edge Riley had rarely heard. "So, what do we do?" Riley gathered the papers, stuffing them back into the satchel. He picked up the steel case and stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. The decision crystallized in his mind, clear and sharp. "We find someone we can trust," Riley said. "Someone outside the chain of command, a reporter maybe, or a congressman. Someone who can blow this wide open. And if we can't? Bennett asked. Riley met his eyes. Then we disappear until we can. They moved again, deeper into the swamp, putting distance between themselves and the crash site. The terrain grew more difficult, the water deeper, the mud thicker. Cypress roots twisted like arthritic fingers, and patches of quicksand lurked beneath deceptive surfaces of floating moss. Riley navigated by instinct and memory, choosing paths that would leave minimal trail. An hour passed, then another. The sun climbed higher, turning the swamp into a steam bath. Riley called for a break near a cluster of tupelo trees, where the ground was slightly elevated and mostly dry. The men collapsed onto logs and roots, gulping water from their canteens. Bennett was still staring at the case. "You think there's more in there, more documents?" "Maybe," Riley said. "Or maybe something worse." Hayes looked up sharply. "Like what?" Riley didn't answer. He was thinking about the phrase test subjects and the roster of bases. He was thinking about the fact that Camp Claiborne was on that list, and that his squad had been pulled from regular duty 3 weeks ago for special training that consisted mostly of waiting around in the swamp. Foster broke the silence. "They're going to come looking for us." "I know," Riley said. "Not just looking. They're going to want that case back bad enough to do whatever it takes." Riley nodded slowly. Foster was right. If the pilot had been shot down to prevent the contents of that case from reaching its destination, then the people who gave that order wouldn't hesitate to deal with a squad of infantry who'd stumbled onto their secret. "We need leverage," Bennett said suddenly. "We need to make copies of these documents, stash them somewhere safe. If they catch us with the originals, at least there's backup." It was a good idea. Riley looked around at his men, seeing the fear in their faces, but also something else: determination. They'd all signed up for different reasons, all come from different places, but right now they were united by something bigger than themselves. "There's a general store about 5 miles south," Riley said. "Old man who runs it, name's Duchamp. French family, been here since before the war. He's got a carbon copier in the back. Used to run a newspaper before he retired." "You trust him?" Foster asked. "I don't know," Riley admitted, "but we don't have many options." They rested for 10 more minutes, then moved out again. The afternoon stretched long and hot, the light turning golden as it filtered through the trees. They heard aircraft twice high overhead, the distant drone of engines cutting through the thick air. Both times Riley signaled a halt, and they froze, watching the sky through gaps in the canopy until the sound faded. By the time they reached the edge of the swamp, the sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the water with shades of amber and rust. Riley stopped at the tree line, studying the dirt road that cut through the marsh grass. On the other side, maybe a quarter-mile distant, he could see the weathered boards of Duchamp's store, a squat building with a tin roof and a porch that sagged in the middle. "Looks quiet," Bennett observed. "Too quiet," Foster said. Riley agreed. The store should have had at least a few customers at this hour, locals stopping by for supplies on their way home. But the parking area was empty, except for Duchamp's old Ford pickup. No smoke from the chimney, no lights in the windows. "Could be nothing," Hayes offered hopefully. Riley didn't think so. He checked his rifle, chambering around as quietly as he could. "Foster, Bennett, circle around back. Hayes, you're with me. We go in through the front. If something's wrong, you hear shooting, you run, don't come back for us. Get these documents to someone who can use them. Understand?" Hayes swallowed hard, but nodded. They crossed the road quickly, moving low and fast. Riley's boots hit the wooden steps of the porch, the old boards creaking under his weight. He paused at the door, listening. Inside, he could hear the faint tick of a clock. Nothing else. He pushed the door open. The store was dim, lit only by the fading daylight through the windows. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, tools, and dry goods. A counter ran along the back, with an old cash register and a stack of newspapers. Behind the counter, the door to the back room stood slightly ajar. Riley moved inside, Hayes following close behind. The air smelled of wood polish and tobacco. Everything looked normal. Too normal. "Mr. Duchamp?" Riley called out. "It's Sergeant Riley, from the base." Silence. Riley moved toward the counter, his finger resting on the trigger guard. He could feel his pulse in his throat, steady but fast. 3 steps from the counter, he heard it. A soft creak from the back room, the sound of weight shifting on old floorboards. He raised his rifle. The door to the back room swung open and a man stepped out. But it wasn't Duchamp. It was a captain. U.S. Army, pressed uniform, sidearm on his hip, and cold eyes that locked onto Riley with the precision of a rifle sight. Behind him, 2 military police soldiers emerged, their weapons already drawn. The captain smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Sergeant Riley," he said quietly, "I believe you have something that belongs to the United States Army." Riley's hand tightened on his rifle. The steel case felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Behind the captain, through the open door, Riley could see Mr. Duchamp tied to a chair, his face bruised, a gag in his mouth. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," Riley said evenly. The captain's smile widened. "Yes, you do. And you're going to give it to me. Right now. Or things are going to get very unpleasant for everyone." Outside, Riley heard the rumble of more trucks pulling up to the store. Boots hitting gravel. Orders being called out. They were surrounded. The captain extended his hand. "The case, Sergeant, don't make this harder than it has to be." Riley looked at Hayes, at the fear in the young man's eyes. He thought about Foster and Bennett, probably pinned down out back by now. He thought about the dying pilot's words, "Don't trust anyone." And then he made his choice. Riley's finger moved to the trigger. The captain saw it, his smile fading into something harder, more dangerous. The 2 MPs behind him shifted their weapons, aiming directly at Riley's chest. The moment stretched thin, like wire pulled to breaking. "Don't be stupid, Sergeant," the captain said quietly. "You fire that rifle, you're dead before you hit the floor. So's your man. So's everyone in your squad outside." "Maybe," Riley said. His voice was steady, but his mind was racing. "But you still don't get the case." The captain's eyes narrowed. "What makes you think that matters?" "Because you wouldn't be here if it didn't." Riley shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his grip. "You would have just sent MPs to the base, arrested us clean. But instead, you set a trap, beat an old man, surrounded us with enough firepower to take down a platoon." He paused. "That tells me whatever's in this case is worth more than a few dead soldiers." For a moment, the captain said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're smarter than your file suggests." "My file?" "Oh yes, Thomas Riley, Birmingham steelworker. Draft notice in 42, 3 disciplinary citations for insubordination. Recommended for officer training twice, denied both times." The captain took a step forward. "You know why you're still a sergeant, Riley. Because men like you ask too many questions." Riley felt Hayes tense beside him. Outside, the sound of trucks idling filled the air. Voices shouted orders. Boots moved in formation. They had maybe 30 seconds before this room became a kill box. "Last chance," the captain said. "The case now." Riley made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He hurled the steel case sideways through the nearest window. Glass exploded outward in a shower of glittering shards. The case tumbled through the air and splashed into the drainage ditch beside the store. The captain's face went white with rage. "Get it!" he screamed at the MPs. Riley didn't wait. He fired twice, not at the captain but at the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling beam. The glass shattered, kerosene spraying across the wooden floor. The MPs dove for cover. Hayes was already moving, kicking over the counter display and sending canned goods crashing across the floor. "Go!" Riley shouted, shoving Hayes toward the back door. They burst through into the storage room. Duchamp was still tied to his chair, his eyes wide above the gag. Riley grabbed his knife, slashing through the ropes in 2 quick cuts. The old man pulled the gag free, gasping. "Back door leads to the dock," Duchamp rasped. "There's a boat." Riley nodded, pulling the leather satchel tight against his chest. Behind them, the captain was shouting orders, boots pounding across the floor. Riley heard the metallic click of rifles being cocked. They ran through the back door and onto a narrow dock that stretched over dark water. An aluminum boat was tied at the end, its outboard motor rusted but intact. Foster and Bennett were already there, crouched behind crates, firing controlled bursts toward the tree line where MPs had taken position. "About time," Bennett called out. "We got company on 3 sides." Riley and Hayes sprinted down the dock, splinters flying from the old wood as bullets chewed into the planks. Duchamp stumbled, and Riley caught him, half dragging the old man forward. Foster laid down covering fire, his shots precise and measured. They piled into the boat. Foster yanked the starter cord once, twice. The engine coughed but didn't catch. Bullets whined overhead, punching holes in the tin roof of the storage shed. Foster muttered, yanking the cord again. The engine roared to life. Bennett cut the mooring line with his knife, and the boat lurched forward into the murky water. Riley looked back and saw the captain burst onto the dock, his sidearm drawn. Their eyes met across the widening gap. The captain didn't fire. He just stood there, watching them go, his face twisted with cold fury. Then he turned and disappeared back into the store. Foster gunned the engine, steering them into the maze of channels that cut through the marsh. The sound of the motor echoed off the water, but it was quickly swallowed by the vast emptiness of the swamp. Behind them, voices shouted orders, but no boats followed. Not yet. "The case," Hayes said suddenly, his voice tight with panic. "Sergeant, you threw it." "I know what I did." Riley's jaw was set. "It bought us time." "Time for what?" Bennett demanded. "They've got the case now. Everything we risked, everything—" "They've got a locked case they can't open without destroying what's inside," Riley interrupted. "And we've still got these." He patted the leather satchel. "The documents. The evidence." Duchamp coughed, wiping blood from his split lip. His voice was rough but steady. "They came this morning, asked if any soldiers had been through. I told them no. They didn't believe me." "I'm sorry," Riley said quietly. The old man shook his head. "Don't be. I've seen men like that captain before, during the Great War back in France. Officers who cared more about secrets than soldiers." He spat blood into the water. "Whatever you found, it scared them." "Good." Foster steered them through narrowing channels, the boat's wake leaving trails in the algae-covered water. The sun was almost gone now, the sky turning purple and gold. Shadows deepened under the trees, and the sounds of the swamp shifted to the nighttime chorus of frogs and insects. After 20 minutes, Foster cut the engine. They drifted in silence, listening. No engines, no voices. Just the water lapping against the aluminum hull and the distant cry of a nightbird. Riley pulled out the documents again, this time reading more carefully in the fading light. There were incident reports, medical logs, and what looked like budget allocations for something called Field Test Protocol 7. One document caught his attention, a memorandum dated 3 weeks earlier. Subject: CT-14, Exposure Incident, Location: Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The memo described an accident during a training exercise. A canister had leaked, exposing 17 soldiers to compound X7. The symptoms were listed in clinical detail: respiratory distress, neurological impairment, internal hemorrhaging. Of the 17 exposed, 12 had died within 48 hours. The remaining 5 were being monitored in an isolated medical facility. Riley's blood ran cold. He recognized some of the names on the casualty list. Men from other companies at Camp Claiborne. Men he'd seen around the base, laughing and smoking and writing letters home. Dead now. Their families told it was pneumonia or training accidents. "What is it?" Bennett asked, seeing Riley's expression. Riley handed him the memo. Bennett read it, his face going pale. Then he passed it to Foster, who read in silence before handing it to Hayes. "They killed them," Hayes whispered. "Our own people killed them." "Not killed," Riley corrected quietly. "Experimented on. And when it went wrong, they covered it up." Duchamp leaned forward. "What's this compound they keep mentioning?" "Chemical weapon, maybe," Foster said. "Something new they're developing." "Or something old they're repurposing," Riley added. He'd seen enough in the steel mills to know how industrial chemicals could be weaponized. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. The Great War had been a laboratory for horror, and apparently someone had learned those lessons too well. Bennett was staring at the papers in his hands. "Why us? Why run these tests on our own soldiers?" Riley didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the company they'd replaced at Camp Claiborne, how suddenly they'd been transferred out. He was thinking about the segregated units, the black soldiers kept separate from the white ones, the way the army created divisions within divisions. "Because we're expendable," Duchamp said, his voice bitter. because they think nobody'll miss a few colored boys from the South. The words hung in the air like poison. Riley wanted to deny them, to say it wasn't that simple, but the evidence was in his hands, typed and stamped and signed by officers who saw soldiers as test subjects and human lives as acceptable losses. Foster broke the silence. So what now? Riley looked at each of them in turn. Hayes, barely old enough to shave, fear and anger warring in his young face. Bennett, smart and questioning, holding the papers like they might burn him. Foster, solid and unshakable, waiting for orders. And Duchamp, an old man who'd been beaten for helping them, who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. "Now we do what that pilot asked," Riley said. "We make sure this gets out. We find someone who can't be bought or scared into silence." "And if we can't?" Bennett asked. Riley folded the documents carefully, sliding them back into the satchel. "Then we make enough noise that they can't silence us all." Foster started the engine again, and they moved deeper into the swamp. The darkness was almost complete now, the water reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. Somewhere behind them, Riley knew, the captain was organizing a manhunt. Troops would be mobilized, search parties would comb the marsh, and eventually they'd be found. But not tonight. Tonight, they had darkness and distance, and the truth burning in their hands. "There's a church," Duchamp said suddenly, 20 miles west near the Texas border. Pastor named Elijah Grant. Good man. Helped folks during the Depression. Ran an underground railroad of sorts for workers escaping the lumber camps. If anyone can get word out quietly, it's him. "Can we trust him?" Riley asked. "Can you trust anyone?" Duchamp shot back. Then his expression softened. "But yes, I'd bet my life on him. Already have, more than once." Riley nodded. "Then that's where we're headed." The boat cut through the dark water, its motor a steady drone beneath the night sounds. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent and eternal. Riley kept one hand on the satchel and the other on his rifle, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. Behind them, somewhere in the maze of channels and muddy banks, the captain stood on the dock of Duchamp's store, holding the locked steel case. He'd pulled it from the ditch, water dripping from its sealed edges. His men surrounded him, waiting for orders. "Put out an alert," the captain said quietly. "Riley and his squad are to be considered armed and dangerous, wanted for theft of classified material and assault on military personnel." "Sir," one of the MPs ventured, "what if they talk? What if they've already—" "They won't," the captain interrupted, "because nobody will believe them. And if they try, we'll make sure they don't live long enough to repeat it." He looked down at the case in his hands, at the combination lock that only 3 people in the entire United States knew how to open. Inside were test results, deployment schedules, and authorization codes for the next phase of Operation Sentinel. Without it, the entire project could be compromised. But more importantly, the case contained evidence that would destroy careers, end reputations, and possibly land several high-ranking officers in federal prison. The captain made a decision. He turned to his men. "Find them. Use whatever resources necessary, and when you do, make it look like they resisted arrest." The MPs nodded and dispersed into the night. The captain remained on the dock, staring into the darkness where Riley and his squad had disappeared. He'd underestimated the sergeant. That was a mistake he wouldn't make again. Far ahead, invisible in the swamp's embrace, Riley felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. They'd escaped for now, but he knew with absolute certainty that this was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. They reached the church just before dawn. It sat on a small rise above the marsh, a white-clapboard building with a cross on the steeple and windows that glowed with lamplight. Riley raised his fist, signaling a halt. The boat drifted toward the muddy bank, and Foster cut the engine. Duchamp led them up a narrow path through tall grass. The front door of the house opened before they reached it. A tall man with grey hair stepped out, his dark eyes taking in the scene with calm assessment. "Duchamp," the man said, "you look like hell." "Feel worse," Duchamp replied. "But we need help, Elijah. These boys have something that men are willing to kill for." Pastor Elijah Grant looked at Riley and his squad, reading the exhaustion and fear in their faces. Then he nodded once. "Come inside. Quickly, Riley told him everything. The crashed plane, the dying pilot's warning, the documents about Operation Sentinel and Compound X7, the dead soldiers at Camp Claiborne. When he finished, the room was silent except for the pop and hiss of the wood stove. Grant stood with his back to them, staring out the window. Finally, he turned around. "Do you understand what you're asking? If we expose this, people will die. Not just you, people in this community." "People are already dying," Riley said. Hayes, who'd been silent since they arrived, cleared his throat. "My brother died at Camp Claiborne 3 weeks ago. They told my mama it was pneumonia." His voice cracked. "But his name was on that list. Vincent Hayes. He was one of the 17. The room went quiet. Riley looked at Hayes, seeing the grief and rage in the young man's face. This wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about Vincent Hayes and the 11 others who'd died while their officers took notes. "I have a friend," Grant said finally. "Works for the Chicago Defender. If anyone will print this, it's them." He paused. "But it'll take time. Maybe 2 days." "We don't have 2 days," Foster said. Grant stood up. "Then we buy you time. There's a root cellar under the church. You can hide there. I'll spread word that you headed west toward Texas." Grant led them to the church as the sun broke over the horizon. Behind the pulpit, he pulled aside a rug, revealing a trap door. "There's water and food down there. It's not comfortable, but it's safe." Riley went down first, the leather satchel pressed against his chest. The cellar was cramped and damp, with a dirt floor and stone walls. When the trapdoor closed, darkness swallowed them. The hours crawled past. Above them they heard muffled sounds, voices, urgent and demanding. Grant's voice responding, calm and steady. Boots on the wooden floor. Riley gripped his rifle, waiting for the trapdoor to fly open, but it didn't. The boots moved away. Engines started outside and vehicles drove off. When the trapdoor finally opened, it was late afternoon. Grant's face appeared above them, drawn and tired. "They're gone. For now." "The captain questioned me, but Duchamp's story held. They think you're heading for Texas. How long before they figure out we're not?" "A day, maybe less. But I got word to Chicago. They're sending someone. Should arrive tomorrow morning." The reporter arrived at 8 o'clock the next day. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, young with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd driven through the night from Chicago with a camera and a notepad. Riley showed her everything. She read in silence, her expression growing harder with each page. When she finished, she looked up. "If I publish this, the army will deny everything. They'll call you liars and traitors. They'll bury you." "I know," Riley said. "Do it anyway." She photographed every document, her camera clicking steadily. Then she copied the most damaging pages by hand. The whole process took 2 hours. When she finished, she packed everything into a leather case. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. "Why risk everything?" Riley thought about the pilot's last words. "Don't let them take the case. Promise me." He thought about Vincent Hayes and the others who died for someone's ambition. "Because someone had to," he said simply. Mitchell nodded, shook his hand and walked out to her car. They watched through the window as she drove away, dust hanging in the morning air. 3 hours later, the sound of trucks on the road, dozens of them, pulling up around the church. Soldiers poured out, surrounding the building. Through the window, Riley saw the captain step down from a jeep. "Sergeant Riley, you're surrounded. Come out with your hands up." Riley looked at his squad. They'd come this far together. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. "We go out," he said, "but we go out standing." They walked out with their hands raised. Soldiers rushed forward, forcing them to their knees. The captain grabbed the leather satchel and opened it. His face went white when he saw it was empty, except for a single sheet of paper. Copies made. Story filed. Truth coming. The captain's hands crumpled the paper. He looked at Riley, and for a moment, pure hatred burned in his eyes. "How you just destroyed your lives," he said quietly. Riley met his gaze steadily. "Maybe, but those 17 men? They'll finally get justice." As they were hauled to their feet, Riley looked back at the church. Grant stood on the porch, watching. The old pastor raised his hand once, a small gesture of benediction. Riley nodded back. 3 weeks later, the article appeared on the front page of the Chicago Defender. Army experiments on black soldiers. 17 dead in Louisiana. The story spread to other papers, then to radio broadcasts, then to Congress. An investigation was launched. Operation Sentinel was shut down. Riley and his squad were held in the stockade for 4 months. When the hearings concluded, they were quietly discharged. Not honorably, not dishonorably, just discharged. Erased from the record as if they'd never existed. But they had existed, and they'd stood for something that mattered. Years later, Riley returned to Louisiana. He visited the church where Pastor Grant had hidden them. The old man was gone, buried in the cemetery behind the building. On his gravestone, someone had carved a simple phrase. He stood for truth. Riley stood there for a long time, remembering that desperate night, the weight of the documents, the captain's cold eyes, and the moment he'd chosen to act. He thought about the cost, the years of struggle that followed, but he also thought about Vincent Hayes and the others. Men who'd been forgotten, who died without knowing why. Because of what Riley and his squad had done, they were remembered now. It hadn't been enough. It was never enough. But it was something. Riley placed his hand on Grant's gravestone, feeling the carved letters beneath his palm. Then he turned and walked away, the Louisiana sun warm on his shoulders, carrying the weight of his choices with quiet dignity. The war had ended years ago, but for men like Riley, the fight for what was right never truly stopped. It just changed shape, evolving into a different kind of battle. One fought not with rifles, but with courage, conscience, and the stubborn refusal to let truth die in darkness. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.